and how empathy training is very important today in teacher education, especially in times like this when all of us seem to be grappling with the pandemic situation in the world and of how students seem to be affected the most by what is happening. But a little more than that are the teachers who are not at all trained to accept what kind of a teaching situation that they are in. While at one point we have children who seem to be, you know, under a lot more stress, under a lot more distress, having to work at home. There seems to be no more eagerness for holidays, but there's some kind of a silent urge to go back to school and to work with the teacher. Where we always spoke about, reading and writing and homework that comes first, we have children today who have developed an urge for reading and writing and doing their homework on their own. Where children ran away from taking up examinations, we have children today who are looking forward for some kind of a test or an examination. At the same time, we've noticed that some kind of a self-discipline has seeped in terms of at least logging in into their classrooms on their own. But what we fail to realize is that the teacher is the one who's going through a lot of stress today, not knowing how to be comfortable to take up a class from within the four walls of her classroom, not being able to interact with her fellow teachers and her peers and understand, what more can be done within the classroom. And at the same time, having to manage that work-life balance and try and see how best, she can manage her home as well as work life is quite a challenge. And I feel this is where empathy towards a teacher is very important. When we look back at our teacher training days, when we look back at the kind of learning that we've had, we realized probably that there was very little of ICT teaching and support or online teaching and support that we ever got exposed to. Sadly, our teacher training programs did not look at it at all. We were busy looking at, all the concepts that we had to work on, all the kind of learning that we had to acquire, and at the same time try and understand how to manage behavior of students within the classroom rather than understand how we can actually work with them remotely. At this point of time, I strongly feel that it is very important that we bring in empathy towards a teacher, because a teacher is the one who requires that kind of training in order to ensure that she delivers the best to her classes. And therefore, I thought it's important for us to debate or talk about a little more on about how empathy training is very important teacher education. Sadly, many other programs have not even bothered to touch upon it. But then with this pandemic situation, I think this is one particular aspect of teacher training that's going to grow very important in the years to come. I start with that note about empathy that is very important for teacher education today, and bring back to you a quote from To Kill a Mockingbird. So very apt in a situation like this, where he says, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb to his skin and walk around it. And this exactly is the situation of a teacher today. And all of this is because there's a lack of training in the teacher. Today, she's worried about how do I control the behavior of my students when I take up classes in MS Teams, when I'm taking up Zoom lessons with them, when I'm busy trying to adjust my camera, adjust my voice, modulate my voice, try and understand what is happening in the child's mind, and yet I do not know how best I'm going to take it forward. On the other side, we have school managements who seem to be, pressurizing the teacher and talking about bringing in newer ways of keeping the child engaged in a remote classroom, newer ways of ensuring that the child's brain is challenged, newer ways of handling both the parent as well as the child in a classroom, which seems to be the situation in most of the teachers' life today. Now, how apt is this? Something that I'm going to look into in the next few slides. There was a time that a teacher thought that she was the only one who was important in the classroom, who looked at herself, more from a narcissist attitude, knew that she had to dress very well to the classroom, knew that she had to prepare herself very well for that particular lecture, looked into how much of reading she could do, discussion she could do with her fellow mate, and straight away walk into the classroom and take complete control of the classroom. Unfortunately, this kind of a tendency has changed today, and she is not only worried a lot more about how she looks and how is she going to present herself. Suddenly, she's got somebody walking behind a screen, and then there's a student who's laughing and chuckling on the other side. This can be very, very stressful for a teacher today. And it's very important that we understand that she doesn't know how to manage the situation, is grappling with that kind of a situation while she is in a remote classroom situation. All of this happens because she hasn't been trained to handle that particular class. She doesn't know how to handle disruptive behavior when it, is happening in a remote classroom like that. She doesn't know how to maintain her work-life balance. On one side, she's busy preparing herself for a classroom, which is more of a situational classroom, where she's got to dress up in order to face the camera. She's got a wider audience. You read about so many articles today where parents are intervening, where parents are talking about how, why aren't you looking at the emotional skill of my child? He's had a bad morning today. Why don't you understand that? Why do you have to build a class, at this particular time in the morning? Now, this is something that requires a lot more training, a lot more empathy with the teacher herself. Now, empathy, of course, I understand is very different from sympathy. We do not need to give the teacher today sympathy. We need to actually understand how exactly she needs to be trained to manage the situation, and how exactly is she going to work with a child which is remotely at home. For a child which has no holiday, which does not have friendship at home, which does not know how to make use of its timing, which does not know how exactly to manage issues where he needs that freedom to get out of the classroom, I really feel it is very difficult for a teacher to manage it remotely. Now, how is she going to work on empathy while working on a classroom that is during this situation is quite an interesting topic for us to look into and debate on. To me, I'm reminded of this particular poem of The Blind Man and the Elephant. So beautifully put in over here. It's a beautiful story which all of us know, which talks about the concept of, um, partial reality that we experience. And this particular parable, probably, once upon found in the Buddhist text, was once upon a time just a poem for us to read and probably interpret it the way we wanted. But then today, when we look at it, we realize that our teachers are in the same situation. They seem to be describing things in different ways, whatever the parents ask or whatever the school management asks for them, as per their perception, as per their way of looking at it. Because one doesn't realize what is a child going through at home. There are issues when parents say that he's becoming very, very disruptive at home. There are issues when the parent says that he seems to be very rude to his siblings at home. There are issues when a parent says that he's simply not willing to sit and write. Now, what is it that the child is going through at home is a big question. All of us teachers are more like the blind man who doesn't know what is reality about the child, the situation that the child is going through at home, and we constantly trying to interpret it in the way in which we are doing it, leading to judgments from the parents at home, judgments from various stakeholders who seem to be getting back and saying that your teacher does not know how to handle a situation. He does not understand what my child is going through right now at home. Now, what is important for us to understand at this point of time is that at times in person education really enables us to work with empathy a lot more than work with empathy when we are in an online classroom. And therefore, we are all like the blind men interpreting in the way in which we look at the situation. Now, this is where I feel a lot more reading on empathy probably has to be shared by school managements as well as teacher trainers, coordinators with teachers to enable them understand how to grapple with situations like this, and at the same time build that kind of sensitivity in the teacher and try and empathize with the child who's facing these situations back home. Like I said a little before, teaching and managing behavior are two different aspects. Teaching comes very easy, whether it is in a remote classroom or it's in an in-person classroom. It is so much more easier because we are in control of what we have decided to train our children with. We are in control about understanding what should be the learning outcomes from one particular session. We are in control when it comes to managing the behavior within the classroom. But managing behavior outside the classroom and yet remotely teaching is something that requires a very, very different mindset. Now, how do we engage these children in such a classroom and also manage their behavior remotely is something that we need to debate upon and understand. As I said a little before, how are we going to look at a child who misses his friends? How are we going to look at a child who feels lonely at home? Sadly, today the situation at home is in such a fashion where we have parents together working from home, where we have maids or their governesses who are not entertained at home, where we do not allow the child to call any of his friends, or as it is live in an environment where we don't have too many visitors coming home, where children seem to be constantly asking questions as to when do I go back to school, right from the questions posed to the teacher to the questions posed back home. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to when are we going to actually go back to normal teaching. You know, more than anything is the worry in a child about being watched over all the time. Our children don't enjoy being, constantly being watched over, wondering whether you're in class, observing what is happening, listening, making notes, answering, participating. I mean, this kind of a thing, that little bit of freedom that the child requires while is within the class, talking to another one, being a little distracted, playing with the paper, playing with the pen, is a part of his natural learning. More than anything, is that sense of boredom that is seeped in today, because there's very little activity apart from the internet and apart from the television that can keep the child engaged today. So overall, we have built in a very, very claustrophobic setup for him, where we don't allow him to step out, neither do we allow anybody else to step in. Now, fix into this kind of a situation a teacher who is absolutely trained in trying to understand the mind of the child. And if she ever happens to rebuke the child while she's in class, or if she ever happens to pick on a particular child while that child is in session and there's some kind of a disruption notice, then you have the parent who comes back and tells you what is happening, why are you not understanding what my child is going through. Now, this demands empathy. This demands a little bit of counseling on a one-to-one level. This demands even mentoring when it is online. Now, how many of us are prepared to do that is a very big question. I'm going to look at how exactly I would picturize a program on understanding empathy for a teacher, and with something which is something that schools can still look at, even if we are, working remotely, or we don't have normal classrooms, but we have teachers who have been coming to the campus and trying to figure out how best we can train them during these times. First of all, how many of us actually understand the root of empathy? It's very important for us to understand that empathy was not primarily developed for a teacher's understanding or for her study to understand surely another person's emotion. But actually speaking, it is very important for a teacher to study it from a very different perspective and try and understand how exactly empathy originated. How exactly was this term coined? Why is it important in teacher training and education? Because unless and until a teacher understands how important it is for her to develop kind of empathy, develop compassion, kindness, and understanding towards another child, and connect with that particular child within the classroom while in a class which is an in-person classroom or online, is very, very important for teacher education. Unless and until she understands these emotions of the children, it's very little that a teacher can do to bring out the best in her child. Now, many a time we understand perspective is in the way in which we look at it. Now, we need to build into the program cases, situations where we need to bring in stories, where we need to bring in a few elements for the teacher to understand what is perspective taking. It's important for us to bring in a topic on judgments when we develop a program on empathy. Sometimes it's so much more easier for us to take a judgment on a child without understanding the trail of emotions that a child is going through. Now, how does a teacher relate to that? How does she understand and realize the significance of how she cannot bring her own examples, her own instances, her own experiences in order to understand a particular child? How does she actually build understanding of a classroom situation? How does she actually work around the child and build around understanding what kind of an emotion is the child going through? Now that becomes an integral component of empathy teaching in teacher training. Experiencing empathy, very, very important for us to build in situations for a teacher to go through those kind of experiences, read a lot more about experiences before she is prepared to go into the classroom and take up a situation like this, rather than crib about it and say, why is this fellow being so difficult in classroom? I simply don't understand. Now, it's not very necessary for us to go through a very, very rigorous teacher training in order to understand empathy, at least during these times of need. It's very important for us to at least read a lot more about empathy, for us to understand what empathy is all about, and to understand how important empathy is for a classroom teacher, especially when it comes to the K to 12 sector. I move on to working on how exactly we could develop a program, for teachers when it comes to practicing empathy in the classroom. The first thing that I feel is very, very easy for a teacher to work on is by, looking at empathy through stories. How do we actually work on it while we are in a classroom, which is on an online mode? Why not take that little break? Where have we been told that those 45 minutes that we are engaging a class for has to be filled with only lectures or has to be filled with only teaching from one side? Why can't we blend our lessons with a lot more stories which actually relate to that particular aspect of what we've been experiencing within the classroom over a period of these months? Why not bring in mythology, mythological stories which actually relate to a child a lot more quicker, and try and see how we can build empathy in a classroom situation even now? Now, this requires a lot more skilling, a lot more understanding of how to weave a lesson plan in such a way that we address these, emotional needs of a child, address these behavior concerns of children while we are engaging them as well. Very rarely do we understand why we're doing history as a lesson in a classroom. It's important that we realize that history also actually can build a lot of empathy and build on, understanding a child's experiences and enabling a child learn from these experiences rather than simply take up a history lesson and leave it at that. Why can't we still think of building a few more empathy activities while we are teaching online? It is possible. It is just that a teacher has to be given these insights and various windows for her to understand and try and see how she can build these activities even while she's working on an online class. Pedagogy certainly needs a shift, because very rarely do we come across teachers in those 35 minutes working around on pedagogy when it comes to online teaching and bringing in empathy into pedagogy. And the last aspect of it would be on assessing empathy. Is it very easy for us to assess empathy while we are in an online classroom? It would have probably been easier for us to do that while we were in a physical classroom, where we would have made anecdotal notes of progression of a child's behavior, or discussed it with the stakeholders and tried and measured the progress of the child at various points. But then how do we go about working on it in an online classroom is an interesting topic for us to debate on. A few examples for what I just now spoke about, building empathy through fairy tales. In a smaller classroom, it's so much more easier for us to work on fairy tales and reinterpret these fairy tales in order to bring about empathy well within the classroom. Now, it has been proved successful when it comes to a physical classroom. But why not use these little clippings while we are working on them in an online classroom as well? Bring in these few stories and talk to them about what they are feeling, while they are at home. What is it that they are feeling while they are working with their parents constantly hovering about them? There are so many more stories that we can pick on and probably develop a lesson where we can blend some of these stories and add value to what we are going within the classroom. Empathy through mythology, simple stories that we can pick on from mythology and get them to relate to it, because it's quicker when they start relating to these stories. It's quicker when they understand how they can practice this for themselves, how they can actually study these actions and try and see how they can work around it and get them to speak about it beautifully, woven into a lesson plan. I think empathy through mythology is one of the biggest tools that a teacher can use. When I talk about empathy through history, I did attend one particular session of a teacher where she looked into William Blake's poem, The Chimney Sweeper, and spoke to them not only about industrial revolution, but spoke to them about child labor, spoke to them about what the child went through in that particular poem, got them to talk about, what they are going through in the home situation. And there was one particular child which brought this about, saying that there are no maids at home, there are no servants at home, and so I'm forced to do so many tasks at home, so many things, that I don't get time to even watch TV. Now here's a child which is calling for empathy, here's a child which is calling for help, here's a child which is trying to express certain things, and it does not mean that the teacher just brushes it off, saying that, but this is a time when you have to help mama. There was something that was going through a lot more beyond what the child was trying to express. Now this requires a lot of empathy again from a teacher. Empathy while it comes to working with activities, important that we get them bonding even when it comes to online sessions. Can they kind of cooperate, collaborate, and work on certain activities? Can we think of activities which requires a lot of understanding of what are the emotions that the child is going through now, and through these assignments can we try and understand what is going on in the child's mind? For this, the teacher needs to first understand herself, understand how she builds on certain activities which will develop this aspect of the child. How do we actually integrate empathy and pedagogy? When it comes to their reading, when it comes to their comprehension, when it comes to giving them a chance to articulate what they are going through, when it comes to sustaining their interest in the class, it may be very, very difficult for us speak to a classroom where we don't have live beings sitting in front of us. We don't even know how to assess whether they are listening to us or no. So what are those special skills that we require in order to build on this particular aspect of understanding whether the child is listening or not? When it comes to writing, is it now enough if we give them an assignment and get them to just write back and submit their assignments? No. Do we have to build on certain more, add on a tinge, a flavor of what more is required to make that writing component help us understand what the child is going through? Can we get and understand, what is he thinking right now? What is he feeling right now? What is he trying to say to me? And how is he doing it in that particular piece task that I have shared with him? Also calls for a lot of empathy. With this, I would like to kind of, I've only given an overview about how empathy is very important in teacher training today. Sadly, our sessions do not go through this. We go through 2 to 3 years of teacher training. We have so many faculty development programs that we sit through, in our training modules when it is conducted for us frequently, whether it's online or in person. Somewhere I feel it is very important for us to understand that a teacher herself, for us to empathize that a teacher herself has not gone through any training, any formal training on it. And unless and until we strengthen that aspect of a teacher, there is very little that we can do in terms of adding value to a teacher's life today. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me.